When Facebook first opened its virtual doors to the public in 2006, it came with promises of connection and community, but the deeper truth behind its rapid growth is far darker. What began as a seemingly innocent platform to bring people together quickly evolved into something else. A digital empire with an insatiable hunger for innovation, influence, and control. By 2015, Facebook had become a near inescapable part of daily life for billions. It introduced a feature that many found unsettling: the ability to appoint a legacy contact to manage your account after your death. On the surface, it seemed practical, even thoughtful. But beneath the veneer of convenience, the feature hinted at something macabre, a digital afterlife where the living could curate the memories of the dead. These legacy contacts couldn't access private messages, but they could manage incoming friend requests, send messages, and even post updates. Facebook wasn't just connecting the living anymore, it was beginning to tether the dead. Then, in 2016, Facebook Live was born, giving users the ability to broadcast their lives in real time. Millions embraced it. But like all tools, it had unintended consequences, and some used it for things far darker than sharing a morning coffee or a birthday celebration. This is where my story begins. In 2002, I was in graduate school at Syracuse University, studying advertising design. That's where I met Jimmy Banks. He was from Boston, a sharp, creative guy with a wicked sense of humor. We clicked immediately, working together on nonprofit projects and dreaming of the future. After graduation, life pulled us in different directions, me to Los Angeles, Jimmy back to Boston. We stayed close at first, but over the years, our connection faded to occasional texts or a quick phone call. By the summer of 2017, we were little more than ghosts in each other's lives. That summer morning started like any other, stuck in the endless crawl of traffic on the 405 freeway, inching my way towards Santa Monica. I was scrolling through my phone to pass the time when a notification popped up. Jimmy Banks is live. It startled me. Jimmy hadn't posted anything in years. I tapped the notification, curious. The stream loaded, and my heart froze. The camera was shaky, the footage grainy. It was nighttime wherever he was. The screen showed a dimly lit room, its walls streaked with shadow. I could barely make out Jimmy's face. He looked gaunt, pale, his eyes hollowed by dark circles. He wasn't speaking, just staring into the camera with an expression I couldn't quite place, somewhere between fear and despair. "Jimmy?" I whispered aloud, as if he could hear me. The video continued. Jimmy's lips trembled, and he finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have much time. If you're watching this, please don't let it find you." The screen flickered, and for a moment, I thought the stream had ended. But then the camera angle shifted, revealing something in the background. A shadow, a figure looming just out of focus. It moved unnaturally, like it didn't quite belong in this world. Jimmy turned to look at it, and the terror in his eyes was palpable. The feed abruptly cut off. I sat there, staring at my phone, my heart pounding. I tried calling Jimmy's number, but it went straight to voicemail. I told myself it had to be a prank, some kind of elaborate joke. But deep down, I knew better. A week later, I got the news. Jimmy was dead. The official story was a heart attack, but something about it didn't sit right with me. And then the messages started, from Jimmy's account. At first, they were simple, "Hey, it's been a while," or "Remember this," accompanied by old photos of us from college. But soon, they grew stranger, cryptic. "It's still here," one message read. Another said, "Don't look for me." I reported the account, assuming it had been hacked, but Facebook wouldn't take it down. "The account is being managed by a legacy contact," they said. I reached out to Jimmy's family, desperate for answers, but they swore they hadn't touched his account. And then one night, I got another notification. "Jimmy Banks is live." I didn't watch it. I couldn't, but I still hear his voice sometimes, late at night, whispering through the static of my thoughts. Don't let it find you. I was sitting in traffic, listening to Front of the Devil by the Grateful Dead, when my phone buzzed with a Facebook Live alert. The notification was from someone named Mata Mermaid 94. The name didn't ring any bells, but curiosity got the better of me. The connection was terrible. Static hissed and popped, and the screen showed nothing but darkness. I was about to dismiss it as a glitch when I heard something, a voice, faint and distorted, struggling to break through the noise. "This is Jimmy," it said. My breath caught. The feed cut off before I could make sense of it. Jimmy? No, it couldn't be. I tried reconnecting, but the live stream was gone. I stared at my phone, my mind racing. Why had I even been alerted to this? I didn't know Madame Mermaid 94. I opened her profile. She was one of those random connections I'd added years ago, likely from a horror movie group I'd joined on a whim. Her feed was sparse, mostly old posts about obscure slasher films and cryptic quotes. Nothing about her seemed familiar. But why would her live broadcast mention Jimmy? I arrived at my office an hour later, still unsettled. With a few minutes to spare before a meeting, I decided to look up Jimmy on Facebook. And that's when my stomach dropped. His profile header read, "Remembering Jimmy Banks." That single word, remembering, stared back at me like a ghostly whisper. On Facebook, it means the account belongs to someone who has passed away. The status can only be set by their next of kin or legal contact, with proof of death required. Jimmy was dead. I sat frozen, staring at the screen. When? How? The last time we'd spoken was over a decade ago. I hadn't even realized how much time had passed. I clicked through his profile, but it was eerily barren. A few old photos, a handful of comments from friends expressing their condolences, but no clues about what had happened or when. The rest of the day was a blur. I couldn't focus. I left work early, telling myself I needed time to process. I parked at a nearby Starbucks and sat in my car for almost an hour, replaying the voice from the live stream in my head. "This is Jimmy." Eventually, I called my wife, Rachel. "I'm coming home early," I said. My voice trembled, and she noticed. "What's wrong?" She asked. "Do you remember Jimmy Banks?" I said softly. He's dead." "What? How do you know?" "I saw it on Facebook. His profile says remembering Jimmy Banks." She paused. "When did he die?" "I don't know. I haven't talked to him in years. I just realized how long it's been." Rachel's voice softened. "Have you talked to Jenny lately?" Jenny was Jimmy's wife. She and Rachel had stayed in touch more than Jimmy and I ever had. "No," Rachel said after a moment. "Not in a few years, but..." "Wait." I saw her post a picture a few days ago, an old wedding photo of her and Jimmy. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. "A wedding photo? Why now?" Rachel didn't have an answer, and neither did I. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing Jimmy's voice from the live stream, the static hissing around it like whispers in the dark. "This is Jimmy." The next morning, I checked Madame Mermaid 94's profile again. The live broadcast wasn't there, no trace of it. It was as if it had never happened. But then I noticed something else. Her profile picture had changed. It wasn't a photo anymore. It was a black screen with faint white text scrawled across it. "He's not gone." I slammed my laptop shut. The voice on the live stream wasn't wrong. It was Jimmy, and somehow he was still here. But whatever had happened to him, I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "I don't have her number. Can you send me her contact info?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Yes, I'll send it right now," Rachel replied. "Call me as soon as you find anything out." I hung up and stared at the endless red taillights ahead of me on the 405. My hands were shaking as I dialed Jenny's number. The phone rang and rang, each chime stretching longer than the last. Finally, her voicemail picked up. "Hi, this is Jenny Banks. I'm not able to take the call right now, but please leave a message." "Hi, Jenny. It's Tyler Lee," I began, my voice cracking. I'm sorry I haven't been in touch. I came across Jimmy's Facebook page today and I paused, the words catching in my throat. Well, I just wanted to talk to you when you have a minute. Please call me back, okay? I hung up, my chest tight. The Grateful Dead album I'd been listening to played faintly in the background, but the cheerful tune of Cumberland Blues felt jarring. I hit the next button, and Black Muddy River began to play instead. Its haunting melody seemed to seep into the air around me, wrapping the car in a heavy, oppressive stillness. As Jerry Garcia sang the chorus, "I will walk alone by the Black Muddy River," a vivid image filled my mind. I pictured Jimmy walking along a dark, endless river, his silhouette barely visible in the shadowy world beyond. Then my phone rang. The sound pierced the quiet, making me jump. The caller ID read Jun Jun. I managed a weak smile. Jenny's daughters, Rachel and Akira, had called her Zhen Zhen when they were little, and the nickname had stuck. Jimmy had even started using it. But now, seeing it on my screen sent a chill down my spine. I answered, my voice shaky. "Hello." "Hello, Tyler," came a quiet, strained voice. "Yes, Jenny, you got my message?" "Yes," she said, her words barely audible. "I'm sorry we haven't called either." "It's okay," I said quickly, trying to fill the silence. "Life's crazy, right?" I forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow. "Jenny, the reason I'm calling is..." I hesitated, the words heavy on my tongue. Where's Jimmy?" There was a long pause on the other end, and then I heard it, a muffled sob. Jenny's breathing was uneven, and when she finally spoke, her voice cracked. "How could you not know?" She whispered, her words thick with tears. Her sobs grew louder, raw and unrelenting, as though she hadn't stopped crying in months. The sound was unbearable, a grief so deep it felt like it was reaching through the phone and wrapping itself around me, ... "Jenny," I said softly, my own voice trembling now. "I didn't know, I saw his Facebook page today, and Tyler," she interrupted, her voice breaking. "Jimmy's gone. He's been gone for over a year." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. A year? How had I not known? "I'm so sorry," I managed to say. I didn't know." Jenny's sobs quieted slightly, but the weight of her grief lingered in the silence. Then, in a voice so soft I almost didn't hear it, she said, "He's still with me." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer. Instead, the line went dead. I stared at my phone, my heart pounding. The silence in the car felt suffocating, the echoes of Black Muddy River still haunting the air. And then, as if in response to the silence, my phone buzzed with a new notification. "Jimmy Banks is live." "He's gone, Tyler," Jenny sobbed, her voice raw and broken. "He died 2 days ago." The words hung in the air like a death knell. "What happened, Jen?" I pressed, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "He just didn't wake up." Her voice trembled. "You know he had that sleep apnea thing, right?" Jimmy's sleep apnea. I remembered it vividly. We'd roomed together at Syracuse, and his snoring was so loud it sounded like a chainsaw. He hated wearing his CPAP mask, though it was the only thing that kept him breathing through the night. Jenny's voice cracked as she continued. "He stopped using the mask 2 years ago. He said he couldn't stand it anymore. But his health got so bad, Tyler. I told him to see a doctor, but he wouldn't listen." My stomach churned as she described what had happened. 2 nights ago, Jimmy had gone to bed as usual. Sometime in the middle of the night, his breathing had stopped. His body, starved of oxygen, had simply given up. Jenny found him the next morning. She thought he was still sleeping, but when she shook him, his body was cold, lifeless. "I called 911, she said, her voice breaking, but it was too late. The paramedics said he'd been gone for hours. They declared him dead at 5:43 am. The image of Jimmy lying motionless in bed burned into my mind, his CPAP mask abandoned on a bedside table, a silent witness to his final moments. Jenny was suddenly alone, left to raise their twin daughters, now 14, on her own. Her grief was palpable, a heavy weight pressing through the phone. "Look, Jenny," I said, my voice firm despite the knot in my throat. "Rachel and I want to come out and help. Let us do that for you." There was a long pause on the other end, filled only with the faint sound of her breathing. "I can't ask you to do that, Tyler," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "We'll be okay." "You don't have to ask," I insisted. "We're coming anyway for the funeral, at least. Let us help with the girls, the house. Whatever you need." Another pause, and then, in a voice so soft it was almost swallowed by the silence, she said, "Okay, yes, I'd be very grateful." "Good," I said, relief mingling with the unease that had settled deep in my chest. "I'll book a flight tonight and be there by morning." As soon as I hung up, I dialed Rachel to give her the update. But as the phone rang, an unsettling thought crept into my mind. Jimmy had been dead for 2 days. So how had I heard his voice on that Facebook live stream earlier today? The phone continued to ring, the sound sharp and insistent, as if daring me to confront the impossible. The Facebook Live alert popped up again. Madame Mermaid 94 is live. I froze, gripping the steering wheel as the notification lingered on my phone screen. I'd told Rachel about the strange feed earlier, but now it was happening again. Against my better judgment, I tapped the notification. This time, the connection was slightly clearer. The screen was still a void of blackness, broken only by jagged static lines that flickered like dying embers. Is anyone there?" a voice crackled through the feed. It was faint, distorted, and chillingly familiar. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. I typed a message into the chat. "Who is this?" No response. I kept watching, transfixed by the eerie darkness. Minutes passed, or maybe it was only seconds. It was impossible to tell. Then the voice returned, clearer now, cutting through the static like a knife. "Jenny," it whispered, stretching the name into a haunting plea. A loud thump-thump broke the silence, like a fist pounding against a door. Then another pause. Thump-thump-thump. The frantic knocking sent shivers down my spine. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the feed went dead. I pulled off the freeway and into a gas station, my hands trembling as I parked the car. "What is going on?" I muttered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. I rested my head against the steering wheel, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen or heard. Was it a sick prank? Some bizarre technical glitch? Or was it something else entirely? I opened Facebook and tried messaging Madame Mermaid 94 directly. "Who are you? What is this?" I typed, sending message after message. But there was no reply. Curious, I scrolled through her profile. It was sparse, just a few posts, mostly unrelated memes and horror movie discussions. But now, a flood of comments had appeared on her most recent post. "Who is this? Please stop," one user wrote. "Is this some kind of joke? It's not funny," said another. It wasn't just me. Other people had seen the same bizarre feed. But what chilled me most was the voice. It had asked for Jenny, and earlier I was certain I'd heard it say Jimmy. I stepped out of the car, the cool evening air doing little to calm my nerves. I went into the gas station, grabbed a drink, and stood in line, trying to ground myself in reality. The fluorescent lights, the faint smell of gasoline, the hum of the refrigerator, it all felt painfully normal, in stark contrast to what I'd just experienced. When I got back in the car, I called Rachel. "Hey," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "I talked to Jenny, and I also need to tell you about something else. Something weird." I explained the live feeds, the voice, the static, the knocking. Rachel was silent for a moment before finally speaking. "How is that even possible?" she asked, her tone skeptical but uneasy. Tyler, you're probably just imagining things. You've got Jenny and Jimmy on your mind, and now you're connecting dots that aren't there. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was trying to reach me. And whatever it wasn't done yet. Perhaps, Rachel said cautiously. But don't you think it's odd that this is happening just days after Jimmy died? I nodded, gripping the phone tighter. It's not just odd, it's wrong. Something about this doesn't feel right. Did you ask Jenny about it? Rachel asked. No, I admitted. I didn't want to upset her. She's barely holding it together as it is. But we need to get out there tonight. She's not doing well, Rachel. She needs us. Rachel agreed, and we scrambled to pack. We made arrangements for our eldest son to watch the younger kids until her parents arrived on Sunday. By 10 p.m., we were on a flight to Boston, the weight of unease following us like a shadow. When we arrived at Jenny's house early Thursday morning, the sight of her broke my heart. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, her eyes hollow, her face pale and drawn. The twins, Rachel and Akira, were still in their pajamas, even though it was nearly lunchtime on a school day. Jenny hugged us weakly, her movements slow, as if even that small effort was too much. Jenny, you need rest, Rachel said gently, guiding her to the bathroom to freshen up before bed. Let us handle everything for now. We've got this, I added. You just sleep. Tears welled in Jenny's eyes, spilling silently down her cheeks. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Rachel and I worked quickly. She got the girls dressed and off to school while I began organizing the house, sorting through piles of mail and making calls about the funeral arrangements. We picked the girls up from school at 3:30 p.m., took them to their favorite restaurant, and brought them back home around 9 p.m. Jenny was still asleep. She's completely drained, Rachel murmured as she sat with the girls in their room, reminiscing about old memories until they finally fell asleep around midnight. Rachel and I were no strangers to roughing it. Over the years, we'd traveled to remote places with our kids, living out of backpacks and sleeping in cramped, uncomfortable spaces. So when Jenny's couch became our makeshift bed that night, it didn't bother us. But something else did. The house was too quiet. It wasn't the kind of peaceful silence that comes with sleep. It was oppressive, heavy, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Rachel had fallen asleep beside me, her breathing soft and even. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. At first, I told myself it was just my imagination, heightened by exhaustion and the strangeness of the past few days. But then I heard it, thump. It was faint but unmistakable, a dull, heavy sound, like something hitting the floor upstairs. I froze, my pulse quickening. Thump, thump. This time, it was louder. Closer, I sat up slowly, straining to hear. The sound came again, rhythmic and deliberate, as if someone or something was pacing just above us. Rachel, I whispered, shaking her gently. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open. What is it? Do you hear that? We both fell silent, listening. Thump, thump, thump. The sound was unmistakable now, each step reverberating through the quiet house. Rachel's eyes widened, and she sat up, clutching my arm. It's coming from Jenny's room, she whispered. I nodded, swallowing hard. Stay here with the girls, I said, grabbing my phone for light as I stood. The stairs creaked under my weight as I ascended, the sound of my footsteps blending with the relentless thumping. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. When I reached Jenny's door, the noise stopped abruptly. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Jenny? I called softly. No response. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside. Jenny lay motionless in bed, her back to me. Jenny? I said again, stepping closer. The air in the room was icy cold, and I could see my breath fogging in front of me. And then I saw it. On the wall, just above Jenny's bed, were 3 dark smudges perfectly spaced, as if someone or something had been pounding against it with inhuman force. My stomach dropped as Jenny stirred, her voice breaking the silence. "Tyler," she whispered, her voice trembling, "he's here." The living room floor was cold and unyielding, even with the thin blanket Rachel and I shared. We had made a makeshift bed out of the few items we'd brought with us, my small travel bag doubling as a pillow. By 2 a.m, we finally drifted into an uneasy sleep. A low vibration near my head jolted me awake. At first, I thought it was a dream, but the persistent hum brought me to my senses. My phone was ringing. I scrambled for my glasses, fumbling in the dark as the glow of the screen illuminated the room. "Madame Mermaid 94 would like to connect with you on Facebook Leave." I froze, staring at the notification. My breath caught in my throat. "What the hell?" I muttered under my breath, shaking Rachel awake. "Honey, wake up." She stirred, groggy and confused. "What is it?" "It's that live feed again," I whispered, holding the phone up so she could see. Rachel sat up, squinting at the screen. "Why now? It's the middle of the night." Before I could respond, the dark, static-filled screen flickered to life. "Hello?" came a faint, distorted male voice. My blood ran cold. "Does that sound like Jimmy to you?" I asked, my voice trembling. Rachel leaned closer, her expression unreadable. "It's definitely a man's voice, but I can't tell. I mean, I haven't talked to him in over a decade." We sat there in silence, the faint voice repeating sporadic words through the crackling static. "Hello, anyone? There?" Each syllable sent a shiver down my spine. "Should we tell Jenny?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Rachel shook her head. "Not right now. It'll just upset her more." Minutes passed, and the voice faded into unintelligible noise. Occasionally, we heard what sounded like metal scraping or clanging in the background, like the creak of rusted chains. Then, from the hallway, a voice startled us both. "What are you watching?" Rachel and I whipped our heads around. Jenny stood there, her silhouette barely visible in the dim light. She had woken up, apparently looking for something to eat. "It's nothing," I stammered, hastily trying to close the app. Just a video someone sent me." Jenny stepped closer, adjusting her glasses as she peered at the screen. "Let me see," she said, her voice sharp with curiosity. "It's really nothing," I insisted, fumbling to shut the app down. My hands were shaking. Jenny's eyes narrowed. "Someone sent you something at this hour." Rachel and I exchanged a glance. There was no hiding it now. We had to say something. "Jenny," I began hesitantly, "I need to ask you something. It's going to sound strange." Jenny frowned, her gaze shifting between Rachel and me. "Okay," she said slowly. "What is it? Can you sit down?" I asked, motioning to the couch. She hesitated, then crossed the room, her movements slow and deliberate. She sat down, her expression wary. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my voice. "Have you ever heard of someone getting messages from—" I paused, searching for the right words. "From someone who's passed away?" Jenny's face paled, and her hands tightened around the edges of her robe. "What are you saying?" I held up my phone, showing her the still live feed. The static-filled screen flickered faintly, the voice cutting in and out. "Hello, Jenny." Jenny's breath hitched. Her eyes widened in horror as she stared at the screen. "That's Jimmy," she whispered, her voice trembling. The room seemed to grow colder, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. "I don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. How is this possible?" Before I could answer, the screen flickered again. The voice grew louder, clearer, as if the connection had improved. "Jenny, help me." Jenny screamed, her hands flying to her mouth as tears streamed down her face. The screen went black, and then, from somewhere deep within the house, we heard it thump. Thump thump. The sound echoed through the silence, growing louder, closer, until it seemed to come from just outside the living room door. "Jenny," Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. "What's happening?" Jenny didn't answer. She was frozen, her eyes fixed on the door, her body trembling. And then, the knocking stopped. But Jimmy's voice came again, this time from somewhere much closer. "Jenny, I'm here." Jenny sat on the couch, her face pale, her hands trembling. Rachel wrapped an arm around her, offering a comforting embrace. "What's going on?" Jenny asked, her voice cracking. This doesn't feel right." I hesitated, then asked cautiously, "Jenny, did you contact Facebook to give them information about Jimmy? To update his account to a memorial one?" Jenny's brow furrowed. "Are you serious?" She replied, her voice sharp with disbelief. "I don't use Facebook. It's a waste of time." And Jimmy didn't either. He hated that stuff. Rachel and I exchanged a bewildered glance. "Wait," Rachel said slowly. "You mean you didn't change his Facebook account to a memorial account?" "No, absolutely not." Jenny's voice rose with panic. "Is that bad? What's going on?" Jenny snatched my phone from my hand, her movements frantic. She opened Jimmy's Facebook page and read aloud, her voice trembling. "Remembering Jimmy Zillow, 1976 to 2018. A heavy silence filled the room as Jenny stared at the screen, her eyes wide with disbelief. "How does Facebook know my husband is dead?" She whispered, her voice cracking. "That's a good question," I said cautiously. "Technically, they need proof like a death certificate to make this kind of change." Jenny's hands tightened around the phone. "But I don't even have a death certificate yet. The funeral director is supposed to give it to me later today." Rachel and I exchanged another uneasy glance. Something was terribly wrong. "Jenny," Rachel said softly, "there's something else." Rachel took the phone from Jenny and navigated to the saved Facebook Live recordings. She played the first one, the distorted voice crackling through the static. "When did you get these?" Jenny asked, her voice rising in panic. "I got the first one yesterday morning," I said, "right before we flew out. The last one came in about 10 minutes ago." Jenny's face twisted in horror. "What?" she cried. Tears welled in her eyes as she stared at the phone. "Who sent these? Who's doing this?" Her voice rose into a scream. "Who is Madame Mermaid 94? No one answered. We didn't have to. The unspoken thought hung in the air like a dark shadow. "No," Jenny whispered, shaking her head violently. "No, don't go there. Jimmy wouldn't do that." "Jenny," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice steady, "we don't know what this is. It could be some kind of hack or—" Jenny didn't let me finish. She turned to the bookshelf and grabbed a small framed photo of her and Jimmy, their faces frozen in happier times. Her hands trembled as she clutched it to her chest. "We weren't the same couple you knew 10 years ago," Jenny said quietly, her voice trembling. "We drifted apart. Jimmy had severe depression. He stopped caring about things, about us." Rachel placed a hand on her friend's shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Jenny," she said softly. Jenny shook her head, tears streaming down her face. Do you think he was seeing someone? This Madame Mermaid 94? The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Rachel and I didn't answer. Jenny's eyes darted between us, desperate for an explanation. Suddenly, the phone buzzed in Rachel's hand. Another notification. Madame Mermaid 94 is live now. Jenny's breath hitched, and she grabbed the phone, her fingers trembling. She opened the live feed. The screen flickered to life, static, darkness, and then, a voice. Jenny. The voice was unmistakable. It was Jimmy. Another alert flashed across the screen, piercing the silence of the dimly lit living room. The voice returned, low and crackling with static. Jenny, are you there? Rachel and I froze, staring at the screen in disbelief. Jenny dropped to her knees on the wooden floor, her hands trembling as she leaned closer to the phone. Yes, I'm here. Jimmy, can you hear me?" she screamed, her voice breaking. I reached out, trying to steady her. "Jenny, he can't hear us," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "The broadcast can only send a signal, but we can text him back." Jenny grabbed the phone from my hands, her fingers fumbling as she typed. "Yes, I am here. It's Jenny. Where are you?" For a moment, there was nothing but silence, the faint hum of static filling the room. Then, the audio fizzled back, a garbled noise that sounded like heavy breathing, followed by faint whispers we couldn't quite make out. The room felt colder. Suddenly, a text message appeared on the screen. The characters were scrambled and uneven, as if typed by someone blind or unfamiliar with the keyboard. "Help. Low battery." The three of us stared at the screen, the message burning into our minds. It didn't make sense. Jenny's breathing grew shallow, and she whispered, "He's alive. He's got to be alive." Before I could stop her, Jenny leapt to her feet, grabbing her coat and shoving her arms through the sleeves. She didn't even bother to change out of her nightgown, throwing on her shoes hastily. "We've got to find him," she said, her voice trembling with desperation. "Jenny, stop," I said firmly, grabbing her by the shoulders and forcing her to meet my eyes. "Jimmy was cremated. You know that. He can't be alive. Someone is playing a sick, cruel game." But she wasn't listening. She broke free from my grip, her eyes wild. No, you don't understand. That was him. I know it was him." She bolted to the kitchen, snatching a set of car keys and scribbling something on a post-it note. Before I could stop her, she was out the door, the cold night air swallowing her as she disappeared into the darkness. Rachel stayed behind, sitting on the couch with the girls, who had been startled awake by the commotion. I stood by the door, unsure whether to chase after Jenny or stay and protect her daughters. The phone buzzed again in my hand. Another alert. I hesitated, then looked at the screen. The live feed was back. This time, the screen wasn't completely dark. It flickered faintly, revealing something that made my blood run cold. A dimly lit room, empty except for a single wooden chair. And on the chair, something was moving, a shadow. The voice returned, faint and distorted, but unmistakable. "Jenny, why aren't you here?" I followed Jenny out into the cold night, my bare feet slapping against the damp pavement. She was already fumbling with the car keys, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "I'll drive," I said firmly, grabbing the keys from her. She didn't argue, instead climbing into the passenger seat as I ran around to the driver's side. Jenny frantically dialed a number scrawled on the post-it note she'd grabbed from the kitchen. Her voice was raw, trembling with desperation. "Hello, this is Jenny Banks. My husband was pronounced dead on Monday, and I need to speak to the coroner immediately. It's an emergency. I'm heading to the cemetery now. Please call me back as soon as you can." I glanced at her, the weight of her words sinking in. Her hands clutched the phone so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The road to the cemetery was desolate, lit only by the faint glow of the moon. When we arrived, the looming silhouette of the mausoleum came into view, its stone walls cold and unwelcoming. A pedestal stood near the entrance, adorned with wilting flowers and a large framed photo of Jimmy. Red velvet ropes cordoned off a marble box that held his cremated remains. Jenny rushed forward, collapsing to her knees before the marble slab engraved with Jimmy's name. Her sobs echoed in the stillness, the sound raw and haunting. The silence was broken by the low rumble of an approaching vehicle. A white van pulled up, its headlights slicing through the darkness. The coroner stepped out, his face pale and drawn under the harsh glare of the lights. "I got your message, Jenny," he said, his voice heavy with concern. "I'm sorry I didn't call back sooner. I came as quickly as I could. What's going on?" Jenny looked up at him, her tear-streaked face a mask of desperation. I stepped forward, my voice steady but low as I explained everything, the strange Facebook Live feeds, the voice that sounded like Jimmy, the cryptic messages. The coroner listened intently, his expression darkening with every word. His hands clenched the keys in his pocket as if grounding himself. When I finished, he exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "This doesn't make any sense," he muttered. "Jimmy was cremated. His remains are right here." He gestured to the marble box behind the ropes. Jenny's head snapped up, her voice sharp and desperate. "Then where is the voice coming from? Who's sending those messages?" The coroner didn't answer immediately. Instead, he motioned for us to follow him back to the van. "Wait," I said, hesitating. "Where are we going? He's been cremated, hasn't he?" The coroner paused, his eyes narrowing as he turned back to us. "Yes," he said slowly, "but I need to check something. There's a record, a chain of custody for cremations. If there's been a mistake..." His voice trailed off, leaving the implication hanging in the air like a dark cloud. Jenny and I exchanged a glance, fear flickering in her eyes. The coroner climbed into the van, and we followed, the cold creeping into my bones as we sat in silence. As the van's engine roared to life, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were driving into something far darker than any of us were prepared to face. I protested, but Ross's response sent a chill through me. His cell phone buzzed with urgency, and his voice was strained. "We're heading to the morgue," he said, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. "He hasn't been cremated yet, as far as I know. We've had a surge in cremations over the past few days. Yours was rescheduled for later today, just before the funeral." I blinked in disbelief. "So he's still in the morgue?" "Yes," Ross replied, his voice flat. "But there's no way he can be alive." I clenched my fists, frustration bubbling up inside me. "Why did you do an autopsy if you already knew the cause of death?" Ross's eyes darkened as he glanced at me. "I didn't actually do the autopsy. It's standard procedure required by the health department. When we know the cause of death and there's no sign of foul play, we call it a post-mortem examination. My tech handled it. No incisions were made, no damage." I sat back in my seat, trying to make sense of his words. Nothing about this situation made any sense. We arrived at a nondescript building tucked away in a remote part of the county. The air inside was thick with the smell of antiseptic and something colder, more unsettling. Ross flicked on the flickering greenish-blue fluorescent lights, casting a sickly glow across the sterile hallways. We hurried down the long, whitewashed corridor, the sound of our footsteps echoing eerily in the silence. Ross led us into the crematorium, where two men and a woman, all dressed in white scrubs, were hard at work, preparing lifeless bodies for cremation. Their movements were mechanical, almost too practiced. He approached a workstation and logged in quickly, his fingers tapping furiously on the keyboard. "Retrieve the body from chamber 23, he ordered one of the techs. The woman nodded and disappeared into the rows of cold chambers. I glanced around at the rows of stacked bodies, stored in these chambers at a chilling temperature of 2 to 4 degrees Celsius, sometimes left for weeks. The thought of it made my skin crawl. Then, from the far end of the room, a scream tore through the silence. A woman's shrill cry echoed off the walls, sending a wave of unease rippling through me. Ross and I exchanged a look, and we raced toward the source of the scream. I could barely process what was happening as we rounded the corner. The woman was standing in front of one of the chambers, her face pale with shock. She pointed a trembling hand inside, her voice barely a whisper. It's him," she gasped, her eyes wide with terror. "It's Jimmy." My blood ran cold. There, inside the chamber, was the unmistakable figure of Jimmy. But he wasn't supposed to be there. He was dead. He had been cremated. The woman's scream echoed again, a sound that sent chills down my spine. Jenny's eyes locked onto the body, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "It's impossible," she whispered. "He can't be here." Ross stepped forward, his face grim. "Get him out of there," he ordered, his voice strained. But as the techs rushed to open the chamber, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The body in front of me was still lifeless, yet the air in the room felt too heavy, too thick with something unspoken. And then, a strange thought struck me. What if Jimmy had never truly left? Sitting before us, on the cold, black, sterile pad of Chamber 23, was Jimmy Banks alive. His body, battered and bruised, looked like it had been through hell. He was famished, barely conscious, his skin pale and clammy. His arms and legs were covered in deep, angry bruises from violently kicking the walls of the metal chamber. His hands were torn and bleeding, scraped raw from pushing, pulling, and clawing at anything he could grasp, desperate to escape. The lack of oxygen to Jimmy's brain that night Monday had caused him to slip into a coma, one so deep it nearly claimed him. But somehow he had survived. Jenny rushed forward, her face a mask of disbelief and horror, and wrapped her trembling arms around her husband. The techs scrambled around, wrapping him in emergency blankets, their faces pale, their hands shaking as they called 911. What the hell is going on here? Ross yelled, his voice a mixture of fury and terror. He turned on the technician, his eyes wild. What did your examination entail? Amber, the technician, stood frozen, her eyes wide, her lips pressed into a thin line. You saw the report, Ross. You signed it, she said, her voice quiet but strained. Amber was new to the morgue, fresh out of college with a degree in mortuary science. At 24, she had the pale, almost ethereal look of someone who spent too much time in the shadows. Her dark hair framed a face marked by piercings and tattoos, the most noticeable of which were the intricate web designs behind her ears, reminiscent of gills from the creature from the Black Lagoon. She had performed the external examination, tested his vitals, documented the identifying marks. He had no pulse, she muttered, her voice growing softer, almost defensive. No signs of life. His body was cold, rigor mortis had set in. He should have been dead. Her words hung in the air, thick with unease. Jenny's grip tightened around Jimmy as she whispered his name, disbelief twisting her features. He can't be alive. He was gone. He was supposed to be gone. But there he was, breathing shallowly, his eyes flickering open, confused and terrified, as if waking from a nightmare that wasn't supposed to end. The room felt colder now, the air heavier. And as I looked around at the horrified faces of the techs, the walls seemed to close in on us. This wasn't just a mistake. Something was terribly wrong. Something that went beyond science, beyond reason. Jimmy had been in that chamber. He had been declared dead. But now he was back, and whatever had brought him back wasn't something we could understand. And as the ambulance sirens wailed in the distance, I couldn't shake the feeling that the nightmare was just beginning. Room temperature, Amber muttered, her voice dripping with a strange, almost mocking tone as she glanced at Ross. The exchange sent a chill down my spine. How could someone so cold be working in a place like this? We stood there, uneasy, watching as Ross, despite his evident frustration, remained calm. The body, Jimmy's body, was still on the cold, sterile slab. Ross, ever the professional, asked the question that hung in the air like a thick fog. Amber, when did the body reach rigor mortis? Amber didn't meet his eyes. She looked away, as if embarrassed by her own incompetence. Well, not exactly, she mumbled. I conducted the examination around noon on Monday, about 4 hours after he was pronounced dead. Rigor mortis can take up to 6 hours to fully set in. Ross's patience snapped. But you didn't confirm it, he yelled, his voice rising with anger. Amber, unfazed, shrugged and removed her white lab coat, throwing it carelessly over the back of a stool. It's getting hot in here, she said flippantly, as if the situation wasn't spiraling into madness. No one laughed. Damn it, Amber. You've created a mess here. Ross's voice boomed, his frustration boiling over. Amber seemed almost indifferent, her casual demeanor unsettling in the face of such a grave error. Beneath her lab coat, she wore a vintage black Fangoria magazine tank top. My heart skipped a beat as Rachel, standing next to me, stealthily stepped on my bare foot, her eyes widening as she discreetly pointed to Amber's shoulder. There, on the fading skin, was a tattoo of a mermaid, her tail curling in a design that could have been pulled straight from the depths of the sea. The numbers 94 were inked beneath it. Madam Mermaid 94. My blood ran cold. "Ross, can I talk to you privately?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. We stepped into a small side office, the air thick with the tension of what we had just discovered. "We've got a problem here," I said, the words hanging in the air like a death sentence. Ross looked at me, confused. "What is it, Tyler?" I pointed to Amber's shoulder, the tattoo still burned into my mind. Amber has a tattoo on her shoulder that matches the username from the Facebook live feeds we've been seeing. Madame Mermaid 94. It's the same account where Jimmy's live videos were coming from. Ross's face drained of color as he processed the information. "I don't understand," he muttered, his voice shaky. I pulled out my phone, showing him the videos we had watched earlier. He glanced at the screen, then at the tattoo on Amber's shoulder. His eyes widened in horror. He stumbled back, hand clapping over his mouth in disbelief. "No," he whispered. "No, this can't be happening." He quickly grabbed his phone, rushing down the hall, making a call. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of fluorescent lights above. Something was terribly wrong, and now we were caught in the middle of it. As Ross made the call, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had brought Jimmy back was connected to Amber, and whatever she was hiding, it was far darker than any of us could have imagined. The ambulance had arrived, its sirens wailing as they rushed Jimmy away on a stretcher. Jenny, her face pale and eyes wide with disbelief, accompanied him, her steps hurried but hesitant. Ross, Rachel, and I stood frozen in place, staring at the chaos unfolding before us. The sterile clinical room felt colder now, suffocating even. Ross and the technicians, still in shock, continued to process the reports, their fingers trembling as they typed into the computer. Amber, the tech, and the other two cautiously reviewed the documents for the remaining bodies in the morgue. And then, a phone began to vibrate. We all looked around, checking our phones, but the buzz wasn't coming from ours. It was coming from Chamber 23. Amber, her face a mix of excitement and guilt, scurried over to the chamber's underlayment. She was frantic, almost feverish, as she pulled something out from the shadows. Her hands trembled as she held up a phone. "I've been looking for this for days," she exclaimed, her voice too high-pitched, too eager. Ross, his face darkening, removed his glasses slowly, his eyes narrowing. He looked at Amber, and I could see the storm brewing behind his eyes. How on earth could this debacle get any worse? He muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Amber rushed to a small workspace and plugged the phone into the charger, the soft click of the plug in the socket sounding unnervingly loud in the silence. Ross snapped, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Why the hell was your phone left in the subject's chamber?" he demanded, his voice shaking with anger. "Please don't tell me you forgot it there." Amber flinched, her face flushing a deep red. "Okay, I screwed up," she spat out, her voice cracking. "Is that what you want to hear?" Ross's response was a low growl, his frustration palpable. "That's the understatement of the year," he hissed. "What the hell were you doing on your phone when you should have been focused on the examination? Do you know how this looks?" The argument continued, but Rachel and I stood there, feeling the weight of the moment. This was no longer just a mistake. This was something far darker, a blunder that could spiral into something we couldn't control, something we might never be able to explain. Amber's phone lit up as it charged, the screen flickering to life. She typed in her password with trembling fingers, her eyes darting nervously around the room. She navigated frantically to the Facebook app, her breath quickening. The screen flashed as she opened the app, but before she could do anything, Ross snatched the phone from her hands with a growl. "Give me that," he demanded, his voice low and threatening. Amber hesitated for a moment, but then, almost as if under some unseen force, she handed the phone over. The room was thick with tension, the air heavy with the unspoken question. What was on that phone? What had Amber been hiding? We all watched as Ross's fingers hovered over the screen, the glow of the phone casting eerie shadows on his face. What he was about to discover could unravel everything we thought we knew. "No, I'm not giving you anything," Amber hissed, her voice trembling as she twisted her body away from Ross. She was visibly panicked now, realizing the gravity of the situation. But Ross, a seemingly mild-mannered man in his early 60s, grabbed her wrist with a strength that belied his age, wrenching the phone from her hands. He clicked a few buttons, and suddenly, the screen flickered to life. It was a video. The video began to play, and it was a live stream. Amber had recorded it herself. It was from Monday, the day she had performed the post-mortem examination on Jimmy. The chilling footage showed her, cold and clinical, as she conducted the autopsy, all the while broadcasting it live to her Facebook group of horror movie fans. The sounds of her voice, detached and professional, echoed through the morgue, a stark contrast to the grim scene unfolding. I stared at her in shock, my stomach churning. Is this what entertainment has come to? Ross's voice was thick with sarcasm, but there was a deep, underlying anger in his words. Amber's face drained of color as the reality of her actions began to sink in. Ross's voice grew colder, sharper. "Amber, you'd better sit down," he said, his tone dark. By now, Amber knew she was in deep trouble, her eyes wide with panic as she realized the weight of her crime. "Amber," Ross continued, his voice ice cold, "you're not only officially fired, but you'll likely never work in this industry again. You've committed a crime, one that will result in an unprecedented privacy lawsuit against the county, not to mention a media firestorm. You've ruined everything." As if on cue, 2 police officers knocked on the door outside, their presence a chilling reminder of the consequences Amber now faced. Ross calmly walked over to speak with them, his voice low and controlled. Meanwhile, I could hear Jenny's voice on the phone in the other room. She was furious, her words sharp and full of disbelief. But beneath her anger, there was relief, a quiet, almost haunting sense of gratitude that her husband was still alive. Over the next several months, the consequences of Amber's actions unfurled in a storm of legal battles and public outcry. A major lawsuit was filed, and the true extent of Amber's twisted obsession with her morbid live streams was revealed. It turned out that this wasn't the first time she had secretly broadcasted autopsies. I had only learned of it when I received a notification from Facebook on Tuesday, alerting me to a live stream Amber had done with Jimmy as her subject. As I dug deeper into her Facebook group feed, my stomach twisted further. There were several other recordings questionable, disturbing streams of autopsies performed without the consent of the deceased or their families. Amber had gone so far as to impersonate the next of kin of several subjects, submitting fake death certificates to social media companies, including Facebook, to gain access to their accounts and broadcast their most intimate, horrifying moments. It was all a sick game to her, a way to feed her twisted obsession with death and the morbid. And now the world would know. Amber Belinda Martin had done this with Jimmy's account and several others. She had hacked into their social media profiles, hijacking their online identities and controlling their accounts long after their deaths. The chilling part was that she didn't just stop there. She manipulated their entire digital presence, broadcasting their final moments to an audience that reveled in her macabre spectacle. And she wasn't done. Nearly a year later, Amber's true, horrifying nature was revealed. She was convicted of 17 counts of criminal impersonation and invasion of privacy. But the nightmare didn't end there. As the investigation unraveled, it was discovered that Amber had escalated her depravity far beyond disturbing online broadcasts. She had orchestrated the murders of an elderly couple, staging their deaths so she could broadcast the autopsies that followed, The truth was even more sinister than anyone had imagined. She had killed to feed her twisted obsession. The court sentenced her to life in prison, without the possibility of parole, and she was sent to the Massachusetts State Penitentiary, where she would rot in isolation for the rest of her days. But even behind bars, the shadow of her crimes lingered. She had scarred more than just the victims she had manipulated. She had left an indelible mark on all who had been touched by her depravity. As for Jimmy, Jenny, and their girls, they fled from the past that had nearly consumed them. They sold their home and moved to Los Angeles, hoping to escape the memories that haunted them. Jimmy and I left our high-powered advertising jobs, finding a new sense of purpose in a quieter, more creative life. We started our own studio, focusing on creating opening and closing movie title sequences in Studio City, a fresh start far from the horrors that had once defined us. Today, we consider the Banks family a part of our extended family. The bond we share with them has become unbreakable, and though the past still lingers in the shadows, we hope to never lose touch with them again. The memory of Amber's twisted actions will forever be etched in our minds, but we are determined to move forward, leaving behind the darkness that once threatened to consume us all.